After 20 days' halt at Tarsus, the army again set out on its march and in 5 days came to the last city in Cilicia. The next province through which they would have to pass was that of Syria, and here the entrance was even more carefully guarded than had been the approach to Cilicia. Between the two provinces were two fortresses, called the Gates of Cilicia and Syria. They were at about 600 yards apart and stood one behind the other on each side of a little river which flowed from the mountains into the sea and formed the boundary between the two provinces. The mountains at this place approached so close to the sea that the walls of the fortresses stretched the whole distance, and the only passage was through gates which opened to admit friends, but remained fast shut when enemies approached. The fortresses were quite impregnable if defended, and it was said that Abrachamas had taken the field against Cyrus with 300,000 men, reinforced moreover by 400 Hellenes who were in the service of the great king. But Cyrus had long ago foreseen this difficulty, as he had foreseen that of entering Cilicia, and had provided against it in the same way. He had desired the fleet to follow him from Tarsus, and had arranged that it should land 2 divisions of troops on the coast of Syria, one in the space between the river and the Syrian fortress, the other on the further side of it, so that the fortresses might be attacked on both sides at the same time. As before, however, it proved unnecessary to carry out the plan. For when Abrachamas heard that Cyrus had made his way through Cilicia, and found moreover that his Hellenes were leaving him to join their countrymen, he turned and fled, never stopping until the waters of the Euphrates were rolling behind him. The only harm that he did to Cyrus was to burn the ferryboats employed for crossing the Euphrates, after making use of them himself. The cowardly satrap remembered the saying that discretion is the better part of valor, and, following the example of the Cilician prince, he took care so to manage matters that, in the quarrel between the two brothers, he should have done something to help both sides. If the great king should conquer, he could urge that he had burned the boats and guarded the walls for a time. If, on the other hand, Cyrus should prevail, he could say that he had given way at his approach and had yielded him free passage. He afterward carried out this policy by bringing an army to the aid of the great king 5 days after the decisive battle between the two brothers had been fought, with a plausible excuse for not having been able to arrive sooner. A day's march along the Syrian coast brought the troops to Myriandus, a populous seaport of Phoenicia, where an active trade brought many merchant vessels to anchor in the bay. Here the army rested for 7 days, and during this time 2 of the Hellene officers, Xenias and Passion by name, hired a ship and sailed away home in it with the greater part of their possessions. These were the 2 officers from whom 2,000 soldiers had deserted at Tarsus in order to take service under Clearchus. They had expected that Cyrus would compel the deserters to return to them, but, knowing that they would serve much better under the general of their own choice, he had allowed them to remain with Clearchus. In consequence of this, the 2 officers were so much annoyed that they determined to abandon the expedition. When their flight became known, the soldiers all expected that Cyrus would send some ships of war in pursuit of them, and that, having been overtaken and brought back, they would be severely punished. But in this they were mistaken, for, instead of acting in any such way, Cyrus called together the remaining Hellene officers and addressed them in an altogether different strain. Xenias and Passion, he said, have deserted, but they are still in my power. I am fully informed as to the route they have taken, and my ships are swifter than theirs. But for all that, I will not pursue them. No one shall be able to say of me that I know how to make use of a man as long as he is with me, but that, when he wishes to leave me, I lay hands upon him and seize his goods. Let them go. They will have to confess that they have treated me worse than I have treated them. I might detain their wives and children who have been left at home under my protection, but they shall not be deprived of them. This shall be their reward for the services they have rendered hitherto. This proof of high-mindedness increased the respect of all the Hellenes for Cyrus. From this point, the route by which the army was to march left the coast and struck inland. The fleet could therefore be of no further service, and Cyrus accordingly sent it home from Myriandus. It was now the hot season, which in Syria is infinitely more trying than anything that is ever experienced in our northern climates. And as the troops were marching southwards, the heat continued to increase in intensity with every day's march. To the Hellenes, everything in these tropical regions was new and strange: the vegetation, the animals, the people, the customs, the ways of thinking, all were very different from anything to which they were accustomed at home. One day they came to a river swarming with great fish. These were worshipped as gods by the people of the country, who would have thought it a great crime to catch them. In the same place there were large flocks of pigeons, which were also considered sacred, and anyone who dared to kill or even to catch one of them would have been severely punished. Towards the end of August, the army reached the large and flourishing city of Thapsacus, on the Euphrates. Here Cyrus called together the Hellene officers and told them plainly that he was marching towards Babylon to make war upon the great king, and that they must communicate this information to the soldiers under them and persuade them to follow him as before. The news was received by the men, not indeed with surprise, for they had long had their misgivings, but with considerable irritation, and many of them cried out that nothing would induce them to go any farther. Their anger was directed, not so much against Cyrus, as against their own officers, whom they accused of having known from the first what was intended, and they said that, by keeping the matter secret, the officers had involved them in an undertaking which, so far at all events, appeared absolutely hopeless. A few days' consideration, however, was sufficient to make them realize their position. What could they do? Ever since leaving Tarsus, they had been marching farther and farther away from their homes, and the reasons which had then decided them to cast in their lot with Cyrus were now even more urgent than before. Again, therefore, they allowed themselves to be persuaded, and once more demanded an increase of pay, which was promised by Cyrus to an extent that exceeded their highest hopes. For he said that, when they reached Babylon, he would give to each man 5 silver mina, which was more than the ordinary pay for a whole year, and that, during the return march, they should receive full pay until they were again among their own countrymen in Ionia. It was now necessary to find some means of crossing the great river Euphrates, and at first it seemed probable that this would be a task of no small difficulty. The boats ordinarily used for the purpose had been burned by Abracamas, and the only thing to be done was to make an attempt at wading through the stream. Happily, this proved to be a far more simple matter than could have been expected, for, when the soldiers stepped into the water, it only reached as far as their breasts, although at this season of the year it was usually very much deeper. The men of Thapsacus said that this was a sign from heaven, and that the stream had been constrained to roll back his waters in order to make way for the man who was destined to wear the royal tiara of Persia. At this time, Menon, one of the Hellene generals, saw an opportunity of gaining an advantage over his comrades, and he used it in a manner that was little to his credit. Before it had been decided whether the Hellenes should continue to follow Cyrus or not, an advance party had been sent out to see if the river could be forded, and had reported that it was possible. On hearing this, Menon called his men together and said to them, "Soldiers, if you will be guided by my advice, you may, with no danger and little trouble, get yourselves farther advanced in the favor of Cyrus than any of your comrades. To him it is of the utmost importance that the Hellenes should cross the Euphrates and support him in his attack upon the great king. If then we take the lead and cross the river today, and they follow us, he will give us credit for having set them a good example. If, on the other hand, they decide not to follow Cyrus, we can easily go back again, but in any case we may be sure that Cyrus will regard us as his most faithful friends, and that, when he has rich appointments and well-paid offices to give away, he will remember us in disposing of them." The prospect suggested by Menon was so alluring that the soldiers fell in readily with his proposal and at once crossed the Euphrates. When Cyrus heard that they were already on the further side, he was greatly pleased and sent them this message: "I have occasion to praise you, and that you may soon have occasion to praise me must be my care, or I should not be Cyrus." He lost no time moreover in testifying his especial gratitude to Menon by sending him magnificent presents. Selfishness was the most conspicuous feature in the character of Menon. His highest aim in life was to amass wealth and to obtain power. A straightforward, honorable man he regarded as a fool, and for his own part shunned neither deceit nor perjury. Whereas other men considered it their duty to honor the gods and to deal justly with their fellows, Menon prided himself only on getting the better of others by cunning and fraud. After crossing the Euphrates, the army followed the course of the river, keeping it on the right, and came in 9 days to the desert. The tract of country that now lay before them was so waste and barren as to be entirely uninhabited. The most they could expect was to meet from time to time with some stranger journeying through it. It was necessary, therefore, to lay in a good store of provisions, and happily the villages on the border of the desert were thriving and well supplied with corn and wine, so that the soldiers were able to load the baggage animals with as much as they could possibly carry. After this, they journeyed for 18 days through a waste of sand, which lay all around them in broad, low waves, like the sea when it is stirred by a gentle wind. There were no trees in this desert, but occasional shrubs and plants, which gave forth a delicious scent. In consequence of the absence of men, wild animals abounded, especially gazelles and wild asses, bustards, and ostriches. Never in their lives before had many of them seen such a creature as a Hellene soldier. When there was a halt, the soldiers went out hunting, but some of the animals were hard to catch. The wild asses were very different beasts from our donkeys, who are justly accused of being both slow and stupid. They were remarkable both for swiftness and intelligence and could not be run down by a single horse, however fleet. When they found that they were being hunted, they would stand quite still until their pursuer was almost within spear range, and then dash away out of reach and again stop to rest. The only way in which the Hellenes could succeed in capturing them was by arranging for several horsemen to take part in the chase. Having placed themselves at suitable distances apart, the first horseman would drive the wild ass as fast as possible towards the next, who would then take up the chase with his fresh horse, and by the time that 2 or 3 horses had been tired out, the wild ass would himself become so exhausted that he was easily caught and killed. As for the ostriches, it was quite useless to pursue them, for, as is well known, they run very swiftly, and moreover add to their speed by the movement of their wings, which they use like sails. Of all the wild animals, the easiest to kill were the bustards, for they, like partridges, can only fly a short distance. They furnished moreover the best eating, although the flesh of the wild ass, which resembled venison, was also excellent. In this desert region, long forced marches were sometimes necessary in order to reach either a spring of water or a place where the horses and beasts of burden could find pasture, but even so, many of them died of hunger. The men also suffered considerably. One day, they came in sight of a city where they felt sure that they would be able to obtain abundance of food. But there was neither boat nor bridge nor any other means of crossing the river, and the stream, at this place, was far too deep for the men to wade through it. They overcame the difficulty, however, by means of a contrivance that is still common in the East. Taking a number of the leather coverings used by the army for various purposes, they made great sacks which they filled with hay and bound together so as to form little rafts capable of supporting a few men and some cargo. The soldiers then rowed themselves over to the opposite shore in these rafts and bought in the town supplies of wheat, millet bread, and palm wine. Another time it happened that they had to march along a narrow way, where the wagons sank so deep in the soft clay soil that the transport animals were unable to drag them through it. Cyrus commanded his barbarian soldiers to pull the wagons along. But they set to work in a surly, lazy manner, and he became so impatient that he drove them away and, turning to his suite, ordered them to put their shoulders to the wheel. These proud nobles were little accustomed to any kind of exertion, but, with the implicit obedience of the Persian subject, they hastened to do the bidding of Cyrus. Laying aside their gorgeous cloaks, but still dressed in their silk vests and trousers, many of them adorned moreover with golden chains and bracelets, they ran to the place, as if each were eager to prove himself more active and zealous than all the rest, and, seizing the dirty wagons, dragged them along until they were well beyond the bad part of the road. Such a spirit of submission was quite unknown among the Hellenes, who were accustomed to treat their superiors in a very different manner. Once already they had manifested their displeasure at the conduct of Clearchus, and about this time another incident of the same sort occurred, which might have led to very serious consequences. It happened that, in passing through the camp, Clearchus saw one of the soldiers of his company engaged in a dispute with a soldier belonging to the company of Menon, and, taking the part of his own man, he did not hesitate to have the other one beaten. This action was resented by the comrades of the man who had been beaten, and, later in the day, when Clearchus chanced to be riding through the camp of Menon with only a few soldiers attending him, a Hellene who was occupied in cutting wood threw his axe at him, while others threw stones and called out after him in an insulting manner. Neither the axe nor the stones hit their mark, but Clearchus was nevertheless beside himself with rage, and, riding furiously to his own camp, he ordered his men to arm themselves and advance without a moment's delay against the company of Menon. On the other hand, the soldiers of Menon, seeing Clearchus and his men about to charge, rushed also to seize their arms and prepare for battle. Meanwhile, one of the other generals, named Proxenus, had seen what was going on, and he also hurried forward at the head of his men and, placing himself between the combatants, implored Clearchus to make peace. But Clearchus only reproached him with estimating far too lightly the insult he had received, and, becoming more furious than ever, ordered him to withdraw. Just then, however, by great good fortune, Cyrus came to the place and, seeing the Hellene troops drawn up in battle array, inquired what was the meaning of it. When he heard all that had passed, he was filled with dismay and cried out, "Ye leaders of the Hellenes, ye know not what ye do. As surely as my barbarians see you fighting among yourselves, my ruin will be sealed, and yours also. Ye will have more to fear from my followers than from the army of my brother." These grave words brought back Clearchus to his right mind. He was filled with remorse, and both sides laid down their arms and made friends again. It was not indeed without cause that Cyrus had referred to the ill will of the barbarians, for they had long since observed with feelings of jealousy and hatred the preference that on all occasions he showed for the Hellenes.